That I had that COVID 2 years ago, but this time it was a bad deal. So, ma'am, Linda, what's she have? Oh, really? Yeah. Well, that was a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. She doing okay though? Okay. Yeah. Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for your love. Thank you for this great weather, Lord. But I heard this afternoon we're going to have a frost next weekend, possibly. So, Lord, we just live in East Texas, and we'll take what you give us. But we just love this weather, and we know that we see your mighty hand on it, Lord, as we see the new life, the calves, the animals, Lord, that are birthing babies right now, and the growth on the trees and the grass. Lord, we just thank you for that. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to just gather up. Pray for Tommy with that COVID, and pray for Miss Linda as she's suffering through that knee, and just pray that that'll get well and she can get on back to church. Lord, be with us tonight. We talked about a little bit different subject tonight. We just give you the glory and honor, and thank you for that. Thank you for some visitors tonight, and we just pray that you'll watch over us tonight and as we go home and bring us back Sunday. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. So the book of Esther. So for the last couple of weeks, I've been looking at Easter and all that coming up, and the resurrection, and what I'm going to preach on in the next few weeks, and so I was looking at the Jewish holidays. So do y'all know what Jewish holiday started at sundown Monday night? It's not a command for a festival like some of the feasts are. There's 4 or 5 feasts that they are commanded by God to celebrate, but this is not. It's a festival. It's a joyous time. It's Purim, 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 and Purim is a celebration. And we're going to walk through the book of Esther tonight, just kind of because that's where this festival came from. That's where it began, is in the book of Esther. And if you've read through the book of Esther or studied it any time, the name God is never mentioned once in the book of Esther, but the whole Purim celebration is about the acknowledgement of the hidden secrets of God, the hidden presence of God, as they celebrate this time, this festival. It takes place in Persia, which today is known as Iran. It takes place in the town of Susa, which was the capital. That's where the royal palace was. There's a lot of opulence, a lot of gold and silver and royal robes and all that. But as you go through the Bible, there's not one time that the Bible talks in a negative manner about any of the Persian emperors. There were some Persian rulers, as we'll see tonight, who tried to eradicate the Jews. Does that sound familiar? Iran is still today trying to eradicate Israel and the Jews from the face of the earth. And so we're going to look at that tonight, and just a few thoughts about that before we look in the book. Characters are King Ahasuerus, which is also known as King Xerxes. You heard that name. Ahasuerus is what they call him here in the book of Esther. Queen Vashti, that's his queen. She's a beautiful woman. We'll find out later that Ahasuerus he liked the ladies, and he had lots of concubines. But she's the Persian princess. We have Haman, who is the chief prince, if you will. He's the ruler that Ahasuerus put in place to just take care of stuff, the armies and a lot of different things. He's the evil guy here. Mordecai is a godly Jew that's living in Persia. He's living in exile, and so how did he get there? Because they got there because the Babylonians had captured these Jews, and when the Jews when Rome was burned by when Jerusalem was burned down by the Romans, there was a dispersal of all the Jews across all the world, and that was called the diaspora. And so these are some of those Jews, and they were captured by the Babylonians, and so some of them just stayed. Some of them went back to Jerusalem, back to Israel, but some of them stayed, and Mordecai was one of those guys. He was a godly guy. He lived there in exile, and all of his ancestry, going back for centuries, was Jewish, including Saul. we know him as the first king of Israel. And then there's Esther. Esther's Hebrew name means star. She really is a star. She was an orphan Jewish girl there in Persia. Mordecai was her uncle, and he adopted her and took her under his wing. And Esther, if you know the story, was chosen by Ahasuerus to be the queen of Persia. And so she was a rising star. She is one of two women who have books of the Bible named after them. And the other one is Ruth, which we studied her several years ago. But Esther she was a godly woman, number one. But she became a courageous leader of women. We need that, a courageous faith. And so, as I said, this past Monday at sundown is when the Jewish people in Israel and all over the world began to celebrate the holiday of Purim. Joel Rosenberg he said, almost every Jewish holiday can be summarized by a single phrase. It's kind of odd, but here's what it says. It says, they tried to kill us, God protected us, let's eat. And so as we go through the book of Esther, it's kind of funny, but it's a sad truth. As we go through the book of Esther, we'll see that they're feasting, they're having banquets, they're festivals, and they're very opulent, and all the nations and the officials from all these provinces are there, the princes. And so nothing's changed today. It's another time. Today is another time. But it's painfully true. It's still true. Nothing's changed because we see that this holiday that commemorates this biblical history, it's still occurring today. Israel is in danger of being wiped out. If you're keeping up with that, Iran is. I read today where it's estimated they are like 83% nuclear ready, and so they're not far away from being fully nuclear. And so the Israelis have said that they will attack their nuclear reactors before they get to that point to protect them. They've been threatened. The Iranians, the radical Islamic government has threatened to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And so I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how that's going to work. But here's the thing. He said, God protected them. Ma'am? You know what? I believe they do. Because number one, they got God. But Israel has weapons. The IDF, the Israeli, the army, they have weapons that we don't have. And they've developed them from materials that we have sent them. So a few years ago when I was teaching on Israel at Crossfront, I don't know if y'all were there, it was back in like 2012 or something. I was teaching about that, and one of the guys, David Surqua, you remember David? David came up to me afterwards, and he had done some training in law enforcement with the Israeli IDF, and he said they were talking about plane hijackings one time, and they asked him, well, how do y'all deal with that? He said, we kill them. That's what the guy told David. We kill them. We don't take hostages. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows, but I do know that they take that serious. The government today is different than it was back then, but they're still God's people, and so we'll see what happens. But anyway, even though God's name is not mentioned in the book of Esther, we see him very dramatically intervene into this situation. He protects the Jewish people from genocide. So, and again, that's not changed today. So I'm just going to walk through these chapters. I want to share some of this stuff with you. In Daniel 4:35, it says that God uses the inhabitants of the earth with the army of heaven to accomplish his will. So that's what we see here in the book of Esther. Esther, like Vashti, Queen Vashti, was obviously very beautiful, and I'll elaborate on that in a little bit. So we're just going to kind of walk through these 10 little chapters. There's not a lot here, but again, I want to remind you that as they talk about King Ahasuerus, he is also known as Xerxes. And so in verse 1 of chapter 1 it says, these events took place during the days of Ahasuerus. He was early in his reign as king. And it says in verse 3, he said he held a feast in the third year of his reign. So here we are, right off, pretty close to the beginning of his reign. He is having a feast, and it says all the officials, all of his staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles and officials from the provinces. He displayed glorious wealth. It was a very opulent time. The wealth of his kingdom and the magnificent splendor of his greatness. There's no doubt as we go through here, you see that his authority, it's a very clear statement about his authority and how he ruled. It says in verse 5, it says at the end of this time, so at the end of that feast, it says he held a week-long banquet in the garden courtyard of the royal palace for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were present there in the palace, this fortress there at Susa. So everybody's invited. And it describes the white and violet linen hangings, the fine white and purple linen cords, silver rods on marble columns, gold and silver couches, just unbelievably expensive. Mother of pearl, precious stones. And then it says beverages were served in an array of gold goblets, and the royal wine flowed freely without any restraint. So what does that tell you? But I mean, this is a week-long deal, and they're imbibing very seriously. And then it says in verse 9 that Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women. So they're into this festival, these feasts. That they believe in eating, just like the Joel said. You know, they tried to kill us. God protect us. Let's eat. So she offers this festival for the women. And so Ahasuerus wanted to show off the beauty of his queen, show everybody how beautiful she was. He wanted those officials to see that. Here's the first red flag. She refused to go. She didn't want to be a part of that. And so here's what happens. When the king in Persia, when the king says, when he commands your presence and you don't come, if you don't lose your head, you are very, very fortunate. So again, here we see his authority it's absolute, but he became furious. It says in verse 12, it said the king became furious and his anger burned within him. And so what did he do? Starting in verse 13, he consulted with all these seers, if you will. He says the experts in the law and justice, and he names a bunch of those guys. And the king asks, so according to the law in verse 15, he says, what should be done with Queen Vashti since she refused to obey King Ahasuerus' command that was delivered to the eunuchs? It says that she wronged not only the king, but all the officials. So what he's saying is, not only did she wrong the king, but she wronged every man. If the man in this city get word of that, we're doomed. That's basically what he's saying. We cannot let this information get out and let the women of this city hear that. And so I mean, you can kind of see where that was going. But it goes on to say that in verse 19, he said, Vashti is not to enter the king's presence, and her royal position is to be given to another woman who is more worthy than she. So he sends out this decree and saying that every man should be the master of his own house. In verse 2, or chapter 2, we see the search for a new queen begins. I mean, Ahasuerus is angry. His rage is bad. And so by the time he gets here to chapter 2, his rage has kind of cooled down. He's thought about what he'd done and what he had decided against her. And so he says, let a search be made for a beautiful young woman for the king. He had an eye for the ladies. There's no doubt about it, because he wanted to show off Vashti. And as we'll see, apparently Esther was also a beautiful young woman. It says the young woman, down in verse 4, says the young woman who pleases the king will become queen instead of Vashti. Now think about this. Remember this as we're going through this. This is all leading up to the festival of Purim, the celebration of God's hidden presence within this whole book. So it says the young woman who pleases the king will become queen instead of Vashti. And so it says in the fortress of Susa there was a Jewish man named Mordecai. He had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the other captives. He was the Jewish guardian of his cousin Esther. And so when her mother and father died, it says that he adopted her and took her as his own daughter. It says Esther was also taken to the palace, placed under the care of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. Mordecai told her, said, don't reveal who you are. Don't tell the king who you are. Don't tell anybody who you are. He had ordered her not to, and so she didn't do that. So here's what happens. All these women, all these concubines who apparently are being looked at by Ahasuerus to become queen, to become his new queen. It says in verse 12, it says, during the year before each young woman's turn to go to King Ahasuerus, the harem regulation required her to receive beauty treatments with oil of myrrh for 6 months. So I don't know how many there were, but it says they had to have this treatment. And then for another 6 months, they had to be treated with perfumes and cosmetics. And so that when they went before King Ahasuerus, they were at their very best. So as we go on through chapter 2, it says, when her turn came to go to the king, she didn't ask for anything except what the official of the harem had given her, what she suggested. And it says Esther won approval in the sight of everyone who saw her. Esther was different. This is all part of God's secret presence in here. It's all part of his plan, these miraculous plans that he has for her, leading up to her becoming the queen of Persia, this Jewish girl becoming the queen of Persia. And so it says in verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won more favor and approval from him than any of the other young women. And it says he placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. And so what happened? It says in verse 18, the king held a great banquet for all the officials and all the staff. It was Esther's banquet. So they're all set, all these women and all these people, Mordecai, they're all sitting at the king's gate. And in verse 20 it said, Esther has still not revealed her birthplace or her ethnic background as Mordecai had directed. She obeyed Mordecai's orders as she always had while he raised her. She was a very obedient child. She was a godly child. Mordecai was a godly man, and he raised her to be that young, godly woman. And so we see towards the end of chapter 2, Mordecai saves King Ahasuerus. What happens there? Well, Mordecai happens to overhear these two guys talking, and they're planning to assassinate King Ahasuerus. It doesn't say why, but when Mordecai learned of that plot, he reported it to the Queen Esther. And he said, you take this information and you give it to King Ahasuerus. The reason she told him that was no one could approach the king without him having called you to come to him. You can't just show up. And so that's the reason Mordecai told her to pass that along to the king. And so we move to chapter 3. Haman. We see the evil Haman show up. This is the dark part of this story here. And so it says after all that took place where Mordecai had given that message to Esther, and it says when the report was investigated and verified, both of those men were hanged on the gallows. That is an event that's recorded in the historical record in the king's presence. So here we are. Haman had risen through the ranks. It was all about him. He was a narcissistic guy, and he was after power and prestige and wealth. And so it says that Ahasuerus promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all the other officials. And it says that the entire royal staff, everyone bowed down and paid homage to Haman because the king had commanded that to be done for him. The king wanted everybody to respect Haman because he was his guy. But Mordecai was Haman's thorn in the flesh. He was not going to bow down to this guy. Mordecai's a Jew, and as we'll see in a minute, we'll see why. But the thing is this: when they knew Mordecai was a Jew, and when the king tells you to bow down and you don't bow down, that is an offense to the king. And it's offense to Haman that you are not bowing down to him because the king had commanded it. And so verse 5 it says, when Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down or paying him homage, he was filled with rage. He was angry. Man, he wanted this guy's head. So what does he do? When he learned that Mordecai was a Jew, when he learned of his ethnic identity, Haman decided not to do away with Mordecai alone. He planned to destroy in verse whatever that is, 6. He says, when he learned of Mordecai's ethnic identity, Haman decided not to do away with Mordecai alone. He planned to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout Ahasuerus' kingdom. And so, to a Jew, here's what bowing down means. That to a Jew, it meant one thing. It meant to bow down only in the temple and only to God. He wasn't going to bow to this guy. And it made Haman mad. And so he comes up with this plan to destroy the entire Jewish race. So Haman goes to King Ahasuerus and says, look, it says there's one ethnic group scattered throughout the peoples in every province of your kingdom, yet living in isolation. Their laws are different from everyone else's, and they do not obey the king's laws. And it's not in the king's interest to tolerate them. Man, he is setting this deal up for these Jews. He is filling the king with all this nonsense. In verse 9 it says, if the king approves, let an order be drawn up authorizing their destruction. And he says, I will pay. Here's the bribe. He said, I'm going to pay. Ahasuerus was all about wealth. And so Haman said, we need to do this, and I will pay 375 tons of silver to the accountants for the royal treasury. 375 tons of silver. Man, I don't know what that's worth, but that's a bunch. And so here's a real important point in verse 10. He said, the king removes his signet ring. Man, that is the big deal. When the king gives you his signet ring, that sets in stone what is about to happen. And so he gave it to Haman. He's the enemy of the Jewish people. And he said, the money and people are given to you to do with as you see fit. So here, the plan is in place. So Haman convinces Ahasuerus to send the letters out throughout the entire province to all the officials. Tell them, hey, here's the deal. He said, destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jewish people, young, old, women and children, and plunder their possessions on a single day. That went out throughout the land. So it says the king and Haman sat down to drink while the city of Susa was in confusion. Lots of confusion. Chapter 4, Mordecai appeals to Esther. He comes to her once again. He said, when Mordecai learned of all that had occurred, he tore his clothes off and put on sackcloth. He put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went into the middle of the city and cried loudly and bitterly. There was great mourning among the Jewish people. They saw what was coming. It said they fasted, they wept, and they lamented. And it says Esther's female servants and her eunuchs came and reported the news to her, and the queen was overcome with fear. She knew that her Jewish ethnicity was going to be revealed. That she knew that was going to happen. So we're all building up now to how this celebration came about. So just hang with me in this story. So it says that Esther summoned one of the king's eunuchs, and sent him to Mordecai to learn about what was going on. So Mordecai tells him everything that had happened, as well as the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay the royal treasurer for the slaughter of the Jews. That's verse 7. So Mordecai says, give the copy of this written decree, ordering their destruction, take it to Esther, explain it to her, and command her to approach the king. Command her. That's pretty strong language, but what he's saying is, take it to the king and beg for mercy for our Jewish people. That's what the message was really, really all about. So verse 11 says, all the royal officials, the people of the royal provinces know that one law applies to every man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard who has not been summoned. Again, you cannot just walk in to see the king. You cannot approach the king unless he has summoned you. And it says that is the death penalty. And she told Mordecai, she said, I've not been summoned to appear before the king for the last 30 days. And she's basically saying, how could I go now? I mean, she's saying, I'll be murdered. Well, in verse 13, Mordecai told the messenger, he said, you reply to Esther, don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you're in the king's palace. Don't think about this. This is going to take courage, and it's going to take your deep-rooted faith for you to follow through with what you need to do. He says, if you keep silent at this time, liberation and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's house will be destroyed. This is probably the most key verse in the whole book. It says, this is what Mordecai tells her. He says, who knows, perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And that is a verse for every one of us. Whatever we've been called to into the kingdom, if we have become a believer and we're a follower of Christ, we may have attained that position for such a time as this. What is your such a time as this? I don't know. Maybe it's in the days we're living in. Such a time as this to go and share the gospel. Go and tell somebody that we love that doesn't know Jesus, doesn't want to hear it. Give them the opportunity. Tell them again. But for such a time as this. Listen, that in 1 Peter 2:9, let me go back over here real quick. And here's what Peter says. He said, now remember, Mordecai tells her, he said, who knows, perhaps you have come to your royal position. And Peter tells us, he said, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood. That's who we are. We're a royal priesthood. Sometimes I don't feel royal. But that's who we are. That's Peter's who's list for such a time as this. And so it's a matter of life and death right now. Esther has to choose. She could choose life or she could choose death. But listen, Mordecai's telling her, we have got to stay united as a people. And we as believers have got to stay united during this day and time. The crazy stuff that we hear and we see, we have got to stand together and stay united. That's what Mordecai's telling her. And here's what Esther told Mordecai in verse 16. It says, go and assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa and fast for me. She said, I need you to go and pray for me and fast for me as I pray about and dig into my faith and my courage to go to the king without being summoned. Don't eat or drink for 3 days or nights. I and my female servants will also fast in the same way. And after that, I will go to the king, even if it's against the law. If I perish, I perish. Man, what a hard prayer to pray. If I perish, I perish. So there just comes a point in our lives where sometimes we just have to take a step back and think about whether or not we're compromising our light or we're compromising our walk with Christ. And who's watching us? People are watching us as believers. And so we just got to come to that point where we say, enough is enough. This is what I'm called to do, and this is what I need to go do. This is how I need to live my life. And so that's kind of where she's at. So Esther goes to the king, and it says in verse 2 of chapter 5, says, as soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she didn't know what was going to happen, but it says she won his approval. He didn't hesitate. He said the king extended the gold scepter in his hand toward Esther, and she approached and touched the tip of the scepter. That was the key to come on. He never hesitated one bit. He wanted to see Esther. He hadn't seen her in 30 days. He wanted to see her. And so she goes, and he says in verse 3, he says, what is it, Queen Esther? Whatever you want, even to half the kingdom will be given to you. Man, what an offer. She says in verse 4, if it pleases the king, may the king and Haman today come to the banquet I have prepared for them. And we're going to have another feast. We're going to get together. We're going to gather up. We're going to eat. But she knows that Haman is the evil guy here. And she goes to the king and says, hey, I want to feed you guys, so let's have a banquet. And he says, while drinking the wine, in verse 6, while drinking the wine, the king asked her, whatever you ask will be given to you. Whatever you want, even to half the kingdom, will be done. He doesn't know what's fixing to happen. But she has laid the groundwork. She's laid the foundation. In verse 7 it says, she answered, this is my petition and my request. If the king approves of me, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and perform my request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet. I will prepare for them tomorrow. So they're having a little banquet tonight, but that's kind of the precursor to the big deal tomorrow. Prepares another banquet. And so Haman, he is an egomaniac. I mean, he is a narcissistic guy. It's all about him. In verse 9 it says, that day Haman left full of joy and in good spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and Mordecai didn't rise or tremble in fear of his presence, he was filled with rage towards Mordecai. Man, Mordecai was not going to bow down to this guy. He believed, he was faithful to his God, and he was not going to bow to that guy. So it says, yet Haman controlled himself, and he went home and sent for his friends and his wife to join him. They came. Then he described for them his glorious wealth. Man, if he had 375 tons of silver to give, that was wealth back in those days. Wealth today, I would imagine. But he said, he described for them his glorious wealth and his many sons, and he told them all that the king had done to honor him and to promote him and rank over other officials in the royal staff. What's more, Haman said, Queen Esther has invited no one but me to join the king at this banquet. Man, he is full of himself. He's feeling good. He said, I am invited again tomorrow to join her with the king. Haman is bragging about himself, his wealth, his many sons, about how the king had honored him and his high rank, and how he was the only one that Esther had invited to be with the king. What? Everybody but Mordecai. But Mordecai. And so he said, none of that satisfies me. He said, I can't be satisfied since I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate all the time. He just can't get over this guy that will not honor him by bowing down to him. So his wife and all his friends said, look here, ask the king in the morning to hang Mordecai on the gallows. So he went out and built some gallows, 75 feet high. But God intervenes. Chapter 6. Mordecai is honored by the king. It says that night, King Mordecai couldn't sleep. He was bothered. And so he ordered the book. They kept the book of the daily events. It's sort of like their journal, their diary of the events that happened during the day. And says they found the book, they brought it, and they read it to the king and reported the time when Mordecai had warned Esther that those two guys had planned to assassinate the king. And so the king, he asked this question. He said, what honor and special recognition have been given to Mordecai for this act? What have we done to honor this guy? And the king's personal attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. So the king asked, who's in the court? Now Haman was just entering the outer court of the palace to ask the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And so the king's attendants answered him, Haman's there standing in the court. Tell him to come on in. Have him come on into the courtyard here. He said, what should be done? So Ahasuerus asked Haman, what should be done for the man the king wants to honor? Haman apparently paused and thought to himself for a minute. He said, who is it the king would want to honor more than me? What a guy. Haman told the king, he said, for the man the king wants to honor, have them bring a royal garment that the king himself has worn. We know that royal garments are purple. It says, and bring a horse the king himself is ridden, which has a royal diadem on his head. Put the garment of the horse under the charge of one of the king's most noble officials. Have them clothe the man the king wants to honor. Parade him on the horse through the city square and proclaim before him, this is what is done for the man the king wants to honor. So the king told Haman, hey man, hurry and do just as you proposed. Take a garment and a horse for Mordecai the Jew. Man, that just popped his bubble, huh? I can't even imagine what he must have, the anger he must have felt, the mortification, the humiliation. He said, here's what he goes on to say. He said, do not leave out anything that you have suggested. So Haman took the garment and the horse. He clothed Mordecai, paraded him through the city square, crying out before him, this is what is done for the man the king wants to honor. Then Mordecai, this godly Jew, he came back to the king's gate, but Haman, overwhelmed, he hurried off for home with his head covered. He's humiliated. The man that he hates the most, despises the most, has been honored by the king, and he has been humiliated. So he told his wife and his friends what had happened, and his advisors said to him, since Mordecai is Jewish and you have begun to fall before him, you won't overcome him because your downfall is certain. They tell him, man, you're done. While they are still speaking to him, the eunuchs of the king arrived and rushed Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So they come get him. Chapter 7. So the king and Haman, they came to the feast that Esther has prepared for them. And it says, once again on the second day while drinking wine. Man, these guys like to drink that wine. Second day. So they're pretty well looped, I would think. The king asked Queen Esther, whatever you ask will be given to you, whatever you seek, even half the kingdom will be done. And in verse 3 of 7, Queen Esther answered, if I have obtained your approval, my king, and if the king is pleased, spare my life. This is my request. Spare my people. This is my desire. For my people and I have been sold out to destruction, death, and extermination. And if we had been merely sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept silent. Indeed, the trouble wouldn't be worth burdening the king. Ahasuerus speaks up and he says, Queen Esther, who is this? Where's the one who would devise such a scheme? She said, the adversary and enemy is this evil Haman. Haman stood terrified before the king and queen, and angered by this, the king arose from where they were drinking wine and went to the palace garden. Haman remained to beg Queen Esther for his life because he realized the king was planning something terrible for him. God is right in the middle of all this. His name doesn't have to be mentioned in this book. He is the one that is secretly, purposefully organizing this event. He set all this up through the godliness of Mordecai and through the godliness of Esther. He realized the king was planning something terrible for him. So just as the king returned from the palace garden to the house of wine drinking, Haman was falling. This is interesting. I didn't really expect this. I've read this a number of times, but as I was studying, I didn't really expect it. It says, just as the king returned from the palace garden to the house of wine drinking, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. It says the king exclaimed, would he actually violate the queen while I'm in the palace? And as soon as the statement left the king's mouth, Haman's face was covered. One of the royal eunuchs said, there's a gallows 75 feet tall at Haman's house that he made for Mordecai, who gave the report that saved the king. King commanded, hang him. Hang him on it. Man, Haman's having a rough day. They hanged him. The king's anger subsided of Haman, enemy of the Jew. Mordecai entered the king's presence because Esther had revealed her relationship to Mordecai. And the king removed his signet ring once again, and he gave it to Mordecai. That's powerful. Gave it to Mordecai, and Esther put him in charge of Haman's estate. Then Esther addressed the king again. She fell at his feet, wept, and begged him to revoke the evil of the Haman the Agagite and his plot he devised against the Jews. Verse 5, she says, in chapter 8, it says, if it pleases the king, and I have found approval before him, and if the matter seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his sight, let a royal edict be written. Let it revoke the documents of the scheming Haman, who wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how could I bear to see this disaster that would come on my people? How could I bear to see the destruction of my relatives? And he says, you may write in the king's name whatever pleases you concerning the Jews, and seal it with the royal signet ring. Whatever is sealed with the royal signet ring cannot be revoked. And so, everything was written exactly as Mordecai ordered for the Jews. 8:10 says, Mordecai wrote in King Ahasuerus' name and sealed the edicts with the royal signet ring. The king's edict gave the Jews in each and every city the right to assemble and defend themselves. That's key. Gave them the right to assemble and defend themselves. And to this day, they live by that statement. The right to gather and to defend. To destroy, kill, and annihilate every ethnic and provincial army hostile to them, the Iranians. Verse 16 of 8, it says, the Jews celebrated with gladness, joy, and honor. That's what Purim is. It is a celebration, a joyful celebration of the acknowledgement of God looking after them, protecting the Jewish people. Again, several times it says there was a celebration and a holiday. It's a holiday where they give gifts. It's a holiday where they celebrate and eat and, I guess, drink. I don't know if they drink today or not. I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't imbibe a little bit. Maybe they have cause to do that. In chapter 9, it says, on the day when the Jews' enemies had hoped to overpower them, just the opposite happened. The Jews overpowered those who hated them. And we can look down through history where this little bitty country God has protected them time and time again. In verse 5 of 9, it says, the Jews put all their enemies to the sword, killing and destroying them. And in the fortress of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and it names some people. They killed these 10 sons of Haman. However, if you remember back, Haman said they plundered. When they killed and destroyed, they plundered. Here it says the Jews did not seize any plunder. They did not seize any plunder. And again, in verse 15, it says the same thing. They did not seize any plunder. And so it became a day of feasting and rejoicing. It became a day of feasting and rejoicing. They go and they say that 3 or 4 different times. It is a holiday. The Purim holiday is a holiday where they send gifts to one another, because during those days the Jews got rid of their enemies. That was the month their sorrow was turned into rejoicing and their mourning into a holiday. They were the days of feasting, rejoicing, and sending gifts to one another and the poor. And for this reason, the days are called Purim, from the word pure. In verse 28 of chapter 9, it says, these days are remembered and celebrated by every generation, family, province, and city, so that these days of Purim will not lose their significance in Jewish life, and their memory will not fade from their descendants. Queen Esther took this second letter with the full authority of the king to confirm the letter about Purim and to confirm these days of Purim. And so Esther's command, verse 32 of 9, confirmed these customs of Purim. And so in chapter 10, it just talks about this being the historical record of the kings of Persia. Mordecai, the Jew, was second only to the king Ahasuerus. He was famous among the Jews. So God gave Esther the tools. He gave her the tools to be the queen that served God, that served her Lord and Savior. His name is never mentioned, like I said, but we see his mighty hand. And it is probably the number one place in the Bible where we see this verse come to life. Romans 8:28. And what does it say? It says, we know We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, those who are called according to his purpose. Esther and Mordecai were called according to his purpose. And it's because of what they did, how God worked in their lives during that period of time in Persia. It's the reason they celebrate joyfully today, because God intervened and has saved them in spite of all the enemies that have tried to kill them. God says, you go and you gather and you destroy your enemies. Purim. Anyway, I hope y'all enjoyed that. It's that's a cool deal. I haven't done that in a long time, but the same thing's going on today. That the Jews face annihilation from Iran. And here's the thing. Joel Rosenberg said the other day. He said, not all of the Iranians hate the Jewish people. They don't. It's just the radical Islamic government that is the Iranians are captives in their own country. They don't live in the same freedoms that we do.